Nobody warned Jeff Beck about Janis Joplin. Not that it would have mattered. It was June 17th, 1967. Monterey, California. The air still tasted like something electric. The kind of electricity that had nothing to do with amplifiers. The Monterey Pop Festival was winding down its second night, and backstage felt like the inside of a pressure cooker. Everyone was either coming off a high or building toward one. There was no in-between at Monterey. Janis Joplin had just walked off the main stage. If you weren't there, it's hard to explain what she'd just done. She hadn't just sung, she'd hemorrhaged. Every word she'd thrown at that audience was soaked in something real. Pain, hunger, this desperate need to be heard that made people in the crowd feel like she was singing directly into their chest. When she finished, people were on their feet before they realized they'd stood up. She came off stage with her arms still shaking. That's important to know. Her arms were still shaking. She grabbed a bottle of Southern Comfort from a roadie, took a long pull, and didn't sit down. Couldn't. That was the thing about Janis. After a performance like that, the energy didn't leave her. It had nowhere to go. She'd pour everything out on that stage and somehow come back fuller than before. Someone told her there was a smaller stage set up near the back, where musicians were gathering for a late-night session. Informal. No cameras, no press, just people playing because they couldn't stop. Janis said she'd come for a few minutes. She stayed for something she didn't expect. Jeff Beck had arrived at Monterey without much fanfare. The Jeff Beck group was barely a group yet. He just put it together a few months earlier. Rod Stewart on vocals, Ron Wood on bass, a vision that wasn't fully formed yet. They were scheduled to play, but nobody in the American press was particularly concerned about them. The British music scene knew who Jeff Beck was. America was still figuring it out. Beck didn't mind. He rarely minded things like that. He was 23 years old that summer, young enough to still be burning with something, but already carrying the kind of quiet that makes people uncomfortable at parties. He didn't work a room. He didn't shake hands enthusiastically or tell people how excited he was to be there. At gatherings where everyone else was performing, even when they weren't on stage, Beck would find a corner and stay in it. Not because he was shy. That was the misread people always made. It was something closer to the opposite. He just didn't need it. The noise, the validation, the constant hum of social performance. He had the guitar for that. When someone told him there was a late-night session happening near the back, he picked up his Telecaster and went. The small stage was nothing. Wooden boards, a few microphones, amps that had seen better decades. Maybe 200 people clustered around it in the California night air, sitting on the grass, passing cigarettes, talking in the easy way people talk when they're not trying to impress anyone. Janis got there first. She jumped on stage without an announcement, grabbed a mic, and the crowd shifted toward her like iron filings toward a magnet. That was just what she did. She started singing something loose, unstructured, a blues thing that didn't have a name yet. Her voice cracked in exactly the right places. People stopped talking. She was in the middle of a line when Beck walked up to the stage. Nobody introduced him. He just climbed the 3 wooden steps, found a spot near the right monitor, plugged in, and stood there while Janis finished what she was doing. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at his strings, adjusted something small on his amp, and waited. Janis saw him. She'd heard the name. Everyone had, in the way you hear names in music circles, passed around like rumors, mentioned with a slight lift of the eyebrow. That means pay attention. But she hadn't seen him play. What she saw now was a lean guy in a rumpled shirt who looked like he might be there to fix something technical. She finished her phrase and nodded at him. He nodded back. That was the full extent of their introduction. They started with a 12-bar blues, safe territory, common language. Janis took the first verse and did what Janis always did. She attacked it. Her voice went up into those registers that don't seem physically possible, then dropped to something gravelly and intimate, then climbed again. It was like watching someone conduct a storm. Beck played underneath her. And here's the thing. He was barely playing. A few chords, some light rhythm work, staying out of her way. The crowd was watching Janis, which was right, which was how it should be. But something was happening on his side of the stage. Between phrases, in the small silences while Janis breathed or pulled back, Beck would place a single note, just one, and that note would sit in the air longer than it should have. It wouldn't decay the way normal notes do. It would hang there, vibrating slightly, and then it would be gone, but the shape of it would stay in the room for a second longer. A few people in the crowd started watching him. Not many, maybe a dozen out of 200, but they stopped moving. Janis noticed. She was mid-lyric, completely in her body, doing the things she did better than almost anyone alive. And she noticed that a handful of people near the front had turned their attention 12 feet to her right. She didn't stop. She was a professional, and more than that, she was in the middle of something real. But the noticing happened, and it planted something small and uncomfortable in the back of her mind. After the first song, someone called out a request. Janis laughed and said something loose and funny. She had that too, the ability to be charming between the devastation. The crowd laughed with her. Beck tuned one string, barely a quarter turn of the peg. In the pause before the next song, Janis said something to the person next to her. She said it quietly, but the stage was small and things carry. She said, "He plays like he's afraid to break something." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even wrong exactly as an observation, but it was a dismissal. The kind of thing you say when someone isn't quite measuring up to the energy in the room. Beck was 4 feet away. He heard it. He didn't react. He looked at his guitar. He adjusted nothing. He just waited for the next song to start. The second song was Janis's entirely. She sang like the festival crowd was still watching, like she was back on that main stage with the lights in the thousands. She gave it everything. Her voice was a living thing that night. Unpredictable, violent in the best sense, capable of making your ribs feel like they were vibrating along with her. When she finished, the 200 people on the grass made a noise that was disproportionate to their number. Then Beck played. Not a response, not a statement. He just started playing. He began on a low string, a single melody line, slow enough that you could follow each note individually. No effects, no tremolo, no volume tricks. Just the sound of a Telecaster through a small amp in the California night, and his fingers moving across the frets like they were looking for something they weren't sure they'd find. The crowd didn't know what was happening at first. It wasn't loud enough to demand attention. It wasn't flashy enough to pull focus. It was the kind of playing that doesn't come and grab you. It waits for you to come to it. And slowly people came to it. The conversations died out one by one, like lights being turned off in a building. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just gradually the noise around the stage faded until the only sound was Beck's guitar and the faint rustle of 200 people trying not to move. He bent notes in ways that made them sound like questions, then answered them with something a half step lower that felt like the saddest possible resolution. He found a melody somewhere in the middle of the song that nobody had heard before and nobody would hear again, because he wasn't reading it from anywhere. He was finding it in real time, right there, under the open California sky. He played for maybe 4 minutes. When he stopped, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the crowd erupted. Not the way they'd erupted for Janis. That had been immediate, visceral, a release. This was different. This was the sound of people who'd just been somewhere they didn't expect to go and weren't entirely sure how to come back from. Janis was standing at the edge of the stage. At some point during those 4 minutes, without fully deciding to, she had stopped being part of the performance and become part of the audience. Her arms had dropped to her sides. The Southern Comfort bottle was on the floor somewhere behind her. She was looking at Beck's hands. He finished and looked up. Not at the crowd, just up, the way you look when you're coming back from somewhere inside the music. He noticed her watching. He didn't say anything. She almost did. The words were right there. Something like, "I didn't mean what I said," or "I was wrong about you," or "just how." Any of the things that come up when someone makes you feel something you didn't choose to feel. But Janis Joplin didn't apologize in the moment. That wasn't who she was. She picked up her bottle. She looked at him for a long second. Then she nodded. A real nod. Not the polite kind. He nodded back. They didn't speak that night. Janis died in October 1970. She was 27 years old. She left behind recordings, interviews, and the memories of the people who knew her when no one was taking notes. One of those people was her close friend Peggy Caserta, who spent years documenting what she remembered of the months before Janis's death. Caserta wrote that sometime in 1969, Janis had mentioned that night at Monterey. Not as a revelation, not as a turning point, just the way people mention things that stayed with them longer than they expected. She said she'd watched Jeff Beck play and realized she'd been thinking about music wrong. Not wrong like she'd been doing it badly. She was Janis Joplin. She'd been doing it better than almost anyone. Wrong like she'd been thinking there was only one way to fill a room. She said Beck had filled that small Monterey stage without taking up any space at all. I told him he played scared, she'd said to Caserta. I was wrong. He plays like he already knows how it ends. Jeff Beck went on to have a career that moved through more styles than most musicians attempt in a lifetime. Jazz fusion, orchestral collaborations, work with artists who had nothing in common except the fact that they wanted to know what he could do to their music. He won 8 Grammy Awards. He influenced guitarists who are still trying to work out what exactly he was doing. He rarely talked about Monterey. In one interview, years later, he was asked about performing alongside singers, the dynamic of supporting someone else's vision with a guitar. He gave a short answer. He said the guitar doesn't need to compete. It just needs to say what the voice can't. That was all he said about it. It was enough.